Ithinar's Bloom by H. Jane Harrington. Chapter 28. Should-haves. We all wear yokes in this world. We're yoked to bias, to dogma, to society. I have not yet met the man whose neck is burdened with freedom. Master Kezias. A rippled flash of silver moved swiftly, and time seemed to slow. The blur passed in front of Kier, catching the arrow full force before it reached her. At first, she thought maybe the hand of a god had snatched it from the air, but her mind wrapped around the truth too late. She caught the tiny figure as it stumbled into her arms. Skilio whirled toward the attacker, his instincts driving him. He launched an arrow quick as lightning. It pierced Jairus' chest with such force that the boy slammed against the barn siding. "Jessia?" Myrtis called, her voice racked with panic. "Jairus?" Kier's eyes were fixed on the child in her arms. Her heart contracted at the shaft protruding from Jessia's back. A crimson stain spread across the silver fabric of her dress. The little girl had accidentally stepped into the path of her own brother's arrow. "Damnation, you little brat! I told you to go back! Why did you come out here?" Kier scolded, gnashing her teeth. "Jessia!" Myrtis howled. She succumbed to mushy knees, and Vaughn caught her. He held the woman tightly against his chest, whispering soothingly into her ear. Kier cradled Jessia tenderly. She doubted that even strong healing magics could have undone the arrow's angry furrow. "I wanted to tell you. I'm sorry for making you cry, Kiriana," Jessia managed. "I thought I could make you happy. Just wanted to be your friend." Kier wanted to berate her for disobeying. She wanted to curse and holler, but no amount of scolding could influence a dying child. Instead, Kier turned the anger inward, at her own inability to stop moving arrows and heal mortal wounds. It was an accident, but one that might have been avoided had Kier only been a tad more careful, or a bit faster, or a little smarter. She should have locked Jessia in her room. She should have cast a wind wisp at the projectile. She should have bound Jairus immediately. She should have... Kier sighed in the realization that her entire life had been composed of should-haves. She replaced the anguished look on her face with a forced smile. "You are my friend. You always will be, kid, for the rest of my life." Jessia's silver eyes were ancient and wise. Kier might not have guessed that eyes so old belonged to someone so very young. "When the gods send me back some day, I hope we'll meet again in this world. You won't ever forget me, will you?" Jessia asked as her voice trailed away. "You know I won't. I never let go of my friends," Kier assured her. Jessia tensed, and Kier gripped her hand firmly. She cradled the child tenderly and stroked the mane of fine silver hair, as much for her own comfort as for Jessia's. It took only one last shuddering breath, and Jessia was gone. Kier closed the tiny silver eyes, then rose and carried Jessia toward the house. She couldn't bring herself to lay the girl in the mud and soil the pretty little dress further. Entering the dining room, Kier laid the body gently on the table, shoring up her own grip on composure, then returned outside. Myrtis was still clutched in Vaughn's arms, whimpering with heart-wrenching cries. Kier approached Skilio, who was standing over Jairus and staring down solemnly. The boy's breathing was raspy and labored. He clutched the arrow protruding from his chest. "My sister," Jairus croaked. Skilio looked to Kier, who shook her head sadly. "You'll see her soon," Skilio told the boy. "I like your pretty clothes," Jairus said. His body shuddered, and he died, smiling. The rains had long since ceased, and the mud was cracking in the heat of the morning sun when Kier left the farmhouse for some fresh air. She had cleaned her soaked and muddied clothes, but somehow she still felt soiled. Myrtis, recovered from her shock, was busy preparing the bodies of the dead for burial, and had insisted she complete the task alone. She said she needed closure, and Kier understood that sentiment. When Vaughn and Skilio joined her on the rotting porch, Kier took the opportunity to fill them in on the happenings while they were off sawing logs. "This house doesn't belong to Myrtis, then?" Skilio asked. "No. The family who lived here was murdered by Siddons and his men. He'd been using the house as a base for his piracy ever since," Kier explained. "Those boxes in the barn? Full of stolen goods. Nabbed from unsuspecting merchants and travelers like us. They didn't always kill the victims. Sometimes just mind-wiped them. But they found it's easier to kill. And more fun. They weren't even interested in us. They just hit a large merchant caravan and were up to their eyeballs in loot. Were going to let us pass right on by." When we approached on our own, I reckon they couldn't let the opportunity slide." "What about Murtis's husband?" Vaughn asked. Her story about a gale shark was true. Her husband and sons were killed in the attack. Sins happened upon them and saved Murtis, but in payment he took her and the surviving children into bondage. Slaves don't always wear collars in Septaria. Kira's jaw clenched and she swallowed a hard lump of nothing. They used the girl to lure in victims, or wipe their memories. Jesha was a psionic and had a knack for manipulating the minds of the unsuspecting. Psionic magic doesn't work well against folks guarding against it, but who would suspect a vulnerable child? She had me roped in pretty good, too. It was when our minds touched that I understood what was happening. I think it was the guardian magic that helped me break free. When I realized you two were in danger..." Kier sighed. "What did they do to the victims?" Skillio inquired hesitantly. Kier swallowed again. "They dumped the bodies in the frost cellar. Made Jarrus do it. Bodies piled on top of bodies. This house..." Kier cast a disturbed look at the structure. "This house is a tomb." "It's done," Murtis said from the doorway. "I'm ready now." She handed Skillio his white cloak, cleaned of the blood and dirt that had splattered it. "It's still a mite wet." He accepted it somberly. "This place holds nothing but evil memories," Murtis said. "If I'm to bury the past, let the house be relieved of its misery, too. It'll be a fit resting place for my children, who lived as tiny candles in a world of darkness." Vaughn placed a comforting arm on Murtis's shoulder. "Is that what you want?" Murtis nodded and tried to speak, but whatever she wanted to say caught in her throat. "I'll do it," Skillio said. "Wait," Kier interrupted. "There's one thing I gotta do first." Kier slipped past Murtis and entered the dining room. She approached Jess's tiny form, laid out peacefully on the table next to her brother. The sight pulled a bow across her heartstrings. This tiny innocent had died in Kier's place, and that was hard to stomach. Kier's hand reached up absently and found the withered white flower that was still woven at her temple. With gentle fingers she tugged it free and placed it in Jess's freshly brushed silver hair. "It looks prettier in yours, my friend," Kier whispered in her ear. She brushed at a stray tear, then turned and walked away, taking the burden of one more memory with her. When she joined them, the group backed away from the porch. Vaughn bowed his head and said, "Here we return to the gods that which was given. The flame is the spark of life they place in us all." Skillio sang a brief song of mourning, his rich tenor filling the crisp air with its pure quality. When the song was concluded, he raised a hand. With a flick of his wrist, he launched an inferno bolt through the door. It ignited quickly, and within minutes had claimed much of the structure. They stood silently, watching the fire consume the house with arms of flame that rolled across the charred beams in desperate hunger. 10 minutes later, even the bones of the house creaked and crumbled. Vaughn turned to Murtis. "Where will you go?" "I don't know. Maybe the gods will let me start fresh. Jesha got her talents from me. I'll try to erase these horrible memories from my own mind." Kier let her own somber mood evaporate into determination. "If there's one thing your daughter taught me, it's about the value of memory. Jarrus and Jesha may have died here, but they'll always live on in you. Never let them go." Murtis nodded in understanding. Without another word, she picked up a small sack and limped westward. The group watched until she disappeared over the hill. Kier strapped her guardian sword on her back, then retrieved her saddlebags and flung them over her shoulder. "Giddy on up, boys," she said. "Storm's over." The men nodded their agreement, anxious to put the smoldering pyre behind them. Galvatine smoothed his fingers over the outdated report on his desk. No matter how many times he read it, the words never changed. He was growing desperate. The young prince had been amazingly resilient, and time was of the essence. Renewing his treaty with the Keepers of Magic had been necessary, but he was beginning to question their effectiveness. That they were overrated as warriors was becoming clear. If they could not fulfill the task of putting a single blade through a single young man, how could they ever hope to maintain order and magic in the ever-growing chaos of the world? A rapping on the door. Galvatine grit his teeth. He'd been waiting for a new report, but the tentative knock told him that the news was ill. Had it been a vigorous knock, he might have held out more hope. "Enter," he called, downing his glass of wine in one swift gulp. Priest Bagley, a pot-bellied man of middle age, poked his head around the door, likely waiting for invitation. "I already said come in," Galvatine barked. Your Eminence, I bring your awaited dispatch. Priest Bagley stepped before the desk and bowed. I was wondering when an update would arrive. Proceed, Galvatine said impatiently. Eminence, the Keepers report their numbers were decimated on the road north of Southport. Keeper Xavian was witness. He reports that His Majesty now has an additional ally. The elder man dropped his aching head into his hands and sat in silence for a moment. He had expected the news, but expectation did not soften the blow. Am I to believe that 2 individuals could manage to defeat 2 units of mages? Who are they? Royal Guard? Nightwind? Galvatine asked, raising his head. No, Eminence. The new assistant appears to be a well-dressed young man, a very handsome and stylish nobleman, from Xavian's words, but... The priest hesitated. He was sweating profusely and wringing his hands. But what, man? Galvatine could feel his blood pressure rising. A woman and a simple nobleman could defeat 6 keepers of magic? It was ludicrous. It appears as though they are His Majesty's guardians. Bagley winced, as though expecting Galvatine to explode into rage. Instead, the high priest sighed deeply. He has guardians now. Suppose that's to be expected. But a woman? And a noble fop? He must really be desperate. Might His Majesty employ a 10-year-old child next? The sarcasm was lost on the fat priest. I do not know, Eminence. Feeling his headache expanding, Galvatine rubbed his thumbs on his temples. Bagley, this threat has gone unchecked for too long. It must be dealt with, and swiftly. I will see to it personally. There is no room for error. If the threat Prince von Asarian represents cannot be eliminated by incompetent keepers, then I will endeavor to eliminate it through political means. He is an intelligent lad, after all. Perhaps I can convince him to see the threat that he poses. You mean to do this yourself, Eminence? Bagley asked, his voice quivering. I do. But on behalf of the other priests, I must protest. Fieldwork is not something one of your age should be undertaking. Rest comfortably in your chambers and allow others to carry out your order, Bagley pleaded. Priest Bagley, do you know how I rose to power as the High Priest of Septaria? Galvatine asked coolly. Bagley shook his head quickly. His second chin shook with it, trying to catch up. By taking matters into my own hands. Delegation begets mediocrity. We're running out of time. His Majesty must not make it to High Imperia. The fate of the world rests on my shoulders. Bagley bowed. Yes, Your Eminence, I will inform the Council of your intentions. Good. Have Grand Master Wardian choose 2 of his best keepers to serve as entourage. Have them brought to my chambers. We must be ready on a moment's notice. When next the Crown Prince calls, we shall pay him a visit.